Madad, everyone, and welcome. For those of you joining us for the first time, we hope you enjoyed this conversation. And for those of you returning for another week, welcome back. We're so happy to have you. My name is Meena, and I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. On behalf of ITREB USA and Canada, we truly thank you for joining us for this week's critical conversation on lived practices of Ramadan. We recognize that we're living in this new world and time in which our normal habits, routines, they just don't hold. The challenges with quarantine and isolation can be unexpected. The things that we're all learning to deal with and engage with in our faith, in our practices, in our context are taking on a new meaning. And at the same time, we may be finding time with loved ones has taken on this new special significance. And our connectivity through mediums like this, where we can come together and have these conversations and learn from one another, gains an increasing importance. So as we navigate this experience, we hope that conversations like today's will help connect us, give us food for thought, spark ideas, provide a space to consider perspectives we might not otherwise spend time thinking about. So a couple of logistics before we get started. You'll see a Q&A box where you can share questions and thoughts as you have them. You're also welcome to use the chat box to send ideas through, and we'll do our best to answer as many of these and address as many of these questions as we can during today's talk. We're actually fortunate to be able to explore today's topic, Lived Practices of Ramadan, with two truly incredible scholars, Dr. Alnoor Dhanani and Dr. Hussein Rashid, who will actually share their own personal experiences, give their knowledge to take us through this conversation. And I can't thank them enough for the amount of effort and time that's gone into putting this together. Dr. Dhanani is someone that I've had the opportunity to work closely with for the last couple of years through the college program on Islam. And we're really fortunate to have someone with his caliber, his experience here to take us through these topics. As you can see from his bio on the screen, there's so much importance and work that he's done for our community and the community at large. And so we're really fortunate to be able to hear from him. We also have Dr. Hussein Rashid, who I personally speaking have followed his videos, and I would say that some of his media and some of the things that he talks about, the ways that he brings ideas about, and just with sort of a candid authenticity, we're very fortunate to actually have him joining us as well. And I would argue we've got two giants who are here with us, among many giants, but two giants to actually take us through a topic that, I think will help us really think about how Ramadan is a lens which we can actually look at history, culture, the meshing of ideas, and thinking about how different people practice their faith. This topic is an especially interesting one because, as I mentioned already, Ramadan is an important month. It's something that we all know and as Muslims around the world recognize. But the fact of the matter is that the rituals and practices truly vary from region to region. The diversity of lived practices is often generalized, and it's really easy to disregard the influence of historical and cultural traditions on the understanding of practices in today's time. And so as a way to get us started, I'll invite both Drs. Dhanani and Rashid to share their stories of Ramadan and their personal understandings. And from there, we'll actually be able to dig deeper into the idea of what lived practices mean, what the implications are of cultural and historical contexts, with two very different examples and unique accounts of Ramadan. So one will be from abroad in Morocco and another much closer to home in the United States. And so with that said, Dr. Dhanani, can you share with us how you have learned to live this practice, to live Ramadan?
So my childhood is in Mombasa. I was born in Mombasa. So I, even though I lived in many other places in East Africa till the age of 17, I remember my time in Mombasa in terms of Ramadan very well. So let me start and tell you about the places that I have stayed in. So so you can see here, this is a kind of schematic of Mombasa, and the part the arrows that I have show you the places I stayed at. Right in the corner, can you guys see the pointer? My pointer? No, I guess not. So there is a red arrow right at the top in the middle, and this is where the Ismaili Jamaat Khana currently is, the old Ismaili Jamaat Khana, the Kuze Jamaat Khana. And the first place that I am told we lived at was there. The second place that we lived at is in the middle of this map, which is at Makadara Road. And then when I was like the age of 6 or so, I lived at the complete left hand of this map. There is an arrow there, and you can see that's also right next to a mosque. And then finally, I lived at this place, which is a little further up on the left, and that's also opposite another mosque. So we were surrounded by all kinds of different Muslim communities, mosques. The area of the old town of Mombasa was very packed in, but everybody knew everybody. Everybody knew everybody's business. Everybody knew everybody's occasions. And so I would call it a Muslim cosmopolitan city. So it's cosmopolitan in a large sense with other communities over time. But for us who are packed into the old town, there was also a lot of Muslim cosmopolitanism. The next slide is really an aerial view of this. So you can see there the really packed part where you don't see any green trees. And then you can see the more modern parts where you have trees. And it's interesting, just from an urban perspective, is over time, the community, Ismaili community that used to be in the old town moved towards the more greener part of the city. So I wanted to show you what the Jamaat Khana looks like. To get to the Jamaat Khana, we had to walk through the if you could go back one, just go back one. Can you go back?
How far back?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, so that's the Jamaat Khana. It's called the Kuze Jamaat Khana. It's in the middle of Old Town. It's a Jamaat Khana from 1922. I'm not sure whether it's exactly this building, but anyway, the building next to it. But that's been around, and you can see that if the Jamaat Khana was there, the community was around. And and in the front map, I didn't point out to you, but the Bora place of gathering is right close to it. The Ishnashri place is close to it. The Baluch place, the Memon place, the Sunni place, everybody is, right next in the same neighborhood. And there you can see the street that you have to walk through to go to Jamaat Khana. It's narrow streets, very much in the style of Muslim architecture. And as you pass by all kinds of really small mosques, the mosque that you see here is a very peculiar architecture that's coastal East African, found in Lamu and Mombasa. Next one. Okay, now here you can see, in a way, during Ramadan, what would happen is the area that used to be the market in a place called Membe Tayari used to actually become a whole open ground for prayer. And it was very interesting that at that time, prayer would be held certainly on Fridays, and obviously the night prayers, which are called the Tarawih prayers, used to be held here also. Next. Now, what I remember about also Ramadan, apart from the mosque, is at night, all these streets would be kind of jam-packed with people. The streets would be lighted. And this particular street is called Digo Road now. It used to be called Salim Road, is where you had lovely food vendors, all kinds of foods that are very peculiar for about Ramadan. Next. There you can see the decoration in the street and the mosque at night for the Tarawih prayer. Next. And there's a lovely foods, as you can see. Those are being sold for the evening breaking of the fast. You can see on the left-hand side, nice some katemimina and some sweet stuff, very much coastal delicacies. You can see the samosas and what we used to call peck potatoes and kebabs on the other side. Next. And there you can see the faluda, which we used to get at the Ismaili restaurant called Blue Room, which is still there, and mishkaki. So these were like very fond memories of foods that people would get from the street and from the restaurants. Next. And finally, everybody loved when Eid came. This is a shot of how Eid prayers are held today. You can see the men in the front, the women at the back. This is held at what I think looks like to me like the Gymkhana grounds. This is not where it was held when I was young, but you can see the changing dynamics, changing. And this is a very important part of lived practice. It's always changing. Populations change, people move in, people move out, places change, the way rituals are done change. And you can see your Eid being held at Gymkhana, which was probably unthinkable in the 1960s when I was there. So this is the way Mombasa looks today. And so when I was 17, for next slide, I moved from East Africa to New York as a student. Can we have the next slide? Yeah. So, in a way, I was now in a place where how to practice my faith, what I understood was my faith, was a very personal choice. Over time, I got a chance to take courses in Islam, in Arabic. That has something to do with the liberal arts university. I was an engineering student. By the time I was graduating, and you can see a picture of me at the age 17 from my passport, there were very few Muslims, but, I had taken these courses. There was 4 of us from East Africa, 2 other Ismailis, one Khoja Ishnashri. And I decided, I remember that when I was young, many Ismailis fasted, but it was a personal choice they made. And I made the personal choice for myself at that time that I would try to fast. I have not always been successful every Ramadan. Think about this particular month, its blessings, self-control, generosity, all of those values that we shall talk about as we go through the rest of this presentation. But this was a turning point in my life, and I've tried to, think about this every year. Hussein, you went to Colombia too.
I did go to Colombia. So first of all, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Yalimat everyone. Thanks for being here. I want to thank ITREB USA and ITREB Canada for inviting us to join in this conversation, and Meena for putting in all the effort to wrangle us as cats. And of course, all of you for being here as participants. What you're going to hear is Alnoor, and I'm going to take the privilege of calling him Alnoor as he calls me Hussein because I've known him for decades now, and you'll hear that story shortly. What we're trying to do is we're trying to tell our stories so you understand different ways in which individual Ismailis approach this month. But as academics, our primary responsibility in this session, our primary responsibility during this session is to really talk about the different ways in which Muslims practice Ramadan around the world. And what does that look like? And that's really, for me at least, and I think for Alnoor as well, is really tied to our personal stories. So as Alnoor mentioned, I was born and raised in New York. This is a picture of Queens Jamaat Khana, which didn't actually exist when I was born. I remember very clearly when we moved into this space. And I was born in 1394 AH, for those of you who are keeping track. You can do the math later on your own. And like most Ismaili children in the 70s and 80s, I was very involved in the community. Of course, was a junior volunteer, was part of one of the first All Ismaili Boy Scout troops, Troop 25, which was, of course, we took the troop number after the Silver Jubilee, which should give you a sense of how far back this troop goes. I went to the original Luma program, where I met Ali Hassani, who was the scholar in residence at the time, and who just over a decade later would end up being my dissertation advisor at Harvard. Of course, after some time going through normal high school and adolescent stuff, I ended up going to college, which, as Alnoor said, was at Columbia University. And Columbia is a really important place for me, because much like Alnoor, this is a place where there was a liberal arts education. And I was exposed, I went in as a pre-med, discovered religion with a wonderful professor, Peter On, who passed away last year, who became my advisor as an undergraduate, but really started exploring what it meant for me to be a Muslim when I wasn't surrounded by Ismaili Muslims all the time. So what happened to me in that community, or what happened to me in the Ismaili community as I was in college, is I continued to serve. I was actually appointed to a regional Aga Khan health board in the Northeast because I was pre-med, and it was sort of at the, not quite the height, but very close to the peak of the AIDS epidemic, to do AIDS education in Jamaat Khana in New York. And it's at that point that I met Dr. Nurjahan Qasim Ali, who was also on health board with me. And I was talking to her about my career options because I was pre-med and I was thinking about religion. She said, you know, you should meet my husband, who is Dr. Alnoor Dhanani. So this is the first connection I had with Alnoor back in the mid-90s, was actually through Dr. Qasim Ali. Within Colombia, I helped start a Colombia prayer gathering for Ismaili students on campus, and that eventually morphed into, with the help of several other people, including Arif Babul, who I believe is on this call, to the Manhattan prayer gathering, which is now the Manhattan Jamaat Khana. While I was trying to figure out what it meant to be Muslim, I actually wasn't involved in the MSA. It wasn't a welcoming place for Shia students. But I did meet lots of other types of Muslims who I connected with. And it was through those individuals, through my academic training, that I really fell in love with Muslim cultures. Remember, this is before Talim, this is before STEP, our REC, and I love my REC teachers, Yasmin Nagji. God rest her soul, was, you know, somebody who was very influential, but it was very much Ismaili history. And it was really through studying Islam in academic setting that I really got an appreciation of Muslim cultures and fell in love with that. And it was through that process that I decided to personally start fasting. And much like Alnoor, some years are better than others. I then moved on to grad school. And it was during that time that 9/11 happened. I was older than some other students. It wasn't as defining for me personally, spiritually, religiously, but it was very defining for me professionally. So I started doing a lot more community outreach, a lot more public advocacy, doing a lot more public writing and media work, working a lot with Muslim communities, Sunni, Twelver, Bora, doing all sorts of connecting, messaging, and trying to explain what it meant to be Muslim in America. And a lot of that experience, both in undergraduate and graduate school, ended up and have continued to inform my teaching and the ways in which I support students now. So what's happening for me in academia now, and how do I think about what my role is that sometimes I'm the only Muslim faculty member that a student will engage with. So what is that? What do I want them to know just being in my presence? How do I act? How do I present myself? Often the course that they take with me on Islam will often be the only course on Islam or religion in general that they'll take. So how do I make sure that they are getting a broad overview in that space? How do I support students, Muslim students, as they're dealing with Islamophobia and as their lives change because, and their practices change of being a Muslim because of Islamophobia? And again, taking a lot of that learning, taking a lot of the work that I've done within the community, a lot of the guidance from within the community, and bringing that out to broader audiences. So I worked with the Islamic Center at NYU, making sure that it was a welcoming space for Ismaili students. I'm now on the Columbia MSA's Alumni Council, helping plan programming. I'll be doing a session with them next week on a prayer attributed to Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam on the welcoming of Ramadan. And now I'm setting up an MSA at the New School where I'm currently teaching. And again, still working with a lot of these experiences and all of that teaching is working beyond the academy. So this is a picture of an exhibit I did at the Children's Museum of Manhattan called America to Zanzibar, Muslim Cultures Near and Far. I'm working on a documentary on Muslims in America, an opera, an indie film, a children's television show, and a series of other museum projects. And a lot of this is just to say that a lot of my experience of what it means to represent myself as an Ismaili Muslim is impacted by the ways in which I studied Islam and the ways in which I experienced Islam both personally and in community, both within the Ismaili Jamaat and outside of it. And so bringing all of that together and manifesting in one particular way, but that's that's the way New York, which is arguably the most diverse collection of Muslims anywhere in the world, has sort of shaped the way in which I interact with my Islam and my understanding of Islam. The last thing I want to say for those of you who are interested in, and like what you hear today, or at least like what I'm saying today and might be interested in hearing more, next Saturday I'm doing a session with ITREB Canada called Truth, Justice, and the Spiritual Way, Imam Ali as Muslim Superhero. The registration link is not live yet, but if you go to the II Canada site, you can register there for the event. And so with that, and thinking about the ways in which Muslim cultures are really a passion for me, is thinking about the ways that we can talk about cultures, because Muslims practice their life in very different ways in very different parts of the world, and time impacts that as well. And for me, I really focus on the United States, but I think Alnoor has a much more global vision. I think, Alnoor, if you want to take it over and maybe talk a little bit about what happens. You've talked about Mombasa, maybe if you could take us to Morocco.
Yes. So in my teaching, as I'd like to show you, I kind of focus on what we may call the lived tradition. And the lived tradition is because, you can study Islam through the texts of Islam, but that is really the view of the text of what Islam ought to be. So we call that essentialist. If you can switch the slide. But if you want to understand what the faith really means, that's everybody has their own idea of Islam, which is why we normally use the lowercase one. That's is not the kind of prescriptive Islam. It's the Islam that people do. So the lived Islam, sometimes called little tradition, is where people think about what they do, they justify it to themselves. It's their own personal commitment that defines how they practice rituals, even though those rituals may be the same as anybody else. But if you were to ask what they were doing, they would have different explanations. So in the textual Islam, it is as if it is all one big piece, and it is really being prescribed by the scholars who are, in a way, looking at texts. But that, they disagree at some point. But in any case, they think they know what the Islam is. So the lived Islam is one that observes Islam from the bottom up through lived practice. The big Islam, the textual Islam, is top down. It's what we call essentialist. This is the way you ought to carry out your Islam. In the lived tradition, diversity is there. It's there because everybody is different and cultures are different and things change over time. While textual Islam is very grudgingly accepting of diversity. It wants to say everybody since the time of the Prophet has practiced in this particular one way, and if they don't, they are wrong. So that's in a way the difference between these two. So in my discussion of Ramadan, what I do in my teaching is I look at ethnography. So if we can switch to the next slide, I look at what are the accounts that people have done, anthropologists, that they've looked at how Islam is lived. And so when I started teaching my course on Islam, introductory course, this book had just come out. It's by Bouitilar. It's called Fasting and Feasting in Morocco. And she spent time living in Morocco with Muslim families, sometimes in Marrakesh, which, as we shall see next slide, is the big city, in Berkane, which is a very small town in eastern parts of Morocco. And she looked at how people think of Ramadan as a time of belonging to the community. She looked at the difference between male practice, women's practice. She looked at ethical engagement, how it's heightened at this time. She looked at special days. She looked at this idea of liminality, how Ramadan is a transformative time. She looked at creeping Salafism, how people said, yeah, but what you're doing is not Islam. It should be done this way because of the Wahhabi influence. And then she looked at how politics interplays, how the king uses Ramadan to, in a way, assert his own privileged place. I can't go through all of this. We're already kind of a little over our time. But, I would like to focus on some aspects as lived practice, not as what everybody does, but how they explain what they do. So the next slide is just the map. You can see the red arrows there. The one on the left is the city Marrakesh, the big city, very Frenchified in some way. And then on the right arrow, you see Barkhan, which is very close to Algeria, different kind of influence. And our author had different experiences, but I can't go into that today. So the next one is, she asked people, why don't they fast during Ramadan? And these are the answers she got. In order to be Muslim, you can see that's like a community. I want to belong to my community. The next one is Ramadan makes one healthy and strong, and that almost looks like a secular health kind of idea. Then somebody said to learn to be patient, and then you can see it's about individual transformation, individual quality. And the final one is on in order for rich and poor to be equal. And you could look at it as secular egalitarianism, but also it's a particular reading of what Islam should be like. So these are the different responses that she got when she was out. But she wanted to look at this more deeply, which is why she did the ethnography of it. So if we can switch to the next one. So this is our Dai, Muayyad Fidin Shirazi. He was a Dai at the time of Imam Mustansir Billah, and he, in a poem, and I'm going to read one part of it, I'll read a little bit more later. It says, then arrived Shaban, which is the month of the pure and noble prophet. And Muslim tradition calls Shaban as the month of the prophet. Shaban comes before Ramadan, because this is a month that he used to do particular things like fast, he'd do voluntary fast beyond the fasting that he would do at other times of the year, including Ramadan. So it is seen as a month that belongs to the Prophet. Next slide. So before Ramadan begins, you can see that she observed that the host had decided to clean house, almost like spring cleaning, except this is called Shaban cleaning. Everything is scrubbed out. And you can see she does this in a courtyard, and Moroccan courtyards are lovely. I don't know what kind of courtyard she had, but the next slide gives you a kind of, at least an architectural sense of two lovely courtyards, and then also some pots and pans in a shop. So you can see this is kind of getting ready, getting prepared. And, and the physical cleanliness is also kind of symbolic of a spiritual cleansing. How do you get ready for this month of Ramadan? Next slide. So preparing. So most of the, and a lot of the work is done by women. So they basically settle anything left over. This is a time that it's a new period, to say goodbye to ordinary life. You want to make up the fast that you missed the previous year. You do extra voluntary fast like the Prophet had done. You pay back borrowed money, or you visit the hammam. You suspend alcohol consumption if that's what you're doing. So this is kind of preparing for Ramadan. This is also a time because, no more parties will be happening for at least a month. We organize weddings. And it is because, the groom will need somebody to give them the Ramadan soup called harira. So this is also a big time for weddings. Parties are held, and in parties, obviously, in modern times, you get a band, but in the old days, the women used to play themselves. So you can see again the kind of dichotomy between wealthy and poor, and how they kind of think of preparing. They also shop. All kinds of foods will be necessary. They will need a particular soup bowl. They will need wooden spoons because they drink the harira, which is the Ramadan soup, with a wooden spoon. So they need that. And this is the time when the shops are full of them. So you can see how the fact of Ramadan is coming is not just about the community, it's also about, the economics of the area. And the mosques put up banners with the Quran and the Hadith and so forth to signify that particular time of life. Next slide. So here you can see this lovely group of singers and dancers. They're called Ganawa, and on the 15th of Ramadan, sometimes there is a Leela or a Layla, or night of dancing and song and trances. Because
Sorry,
yes?
Yes, you said 15th of Ramadan, but 15th of Shaban, right?
15th of Shaban, exactly, you're right, yeah. So basically this is a night where they have to, the prophetic tradition and understanding is that in Ramadan, all the jinn and shaitan are locked up. And so, but when they come back, they'll be pretty unhappy that they were locked up. So the 15th of Shaban, to get ready, is to kind of mollify them so they don't get so upset. And so the Benawa play a role in the rituals in there. So there you can see kind of a cultural aspect. This is not something that you'll find elsewhere in the Muslim world. You know, in Morocco, people wait to see the moon. And once they see the moon, they greet each other. They say, Ramadan Kareem, may Ramadan be generous to you. It's a time for generosity, but also it's a time to accept the gift that Ramadan gives for us to be introspective, to transform ourselves. And in that sense, Ramadan is seen as being generous. And you give mabruk to people for Ramadan, and you get, may God also bless you during Ramadan. You know, there is ululation. I will not try to do it. This is the women do this, and they have this wonderful chants, you know, Papa Ramadan is my Ramadan, and you, I said, into you I sell my trousers, because, you know, you have to spend money to get all the things for the nice Ramadan feasts and gifts and so forth. So you're willing to even sell the trousers that you're wearing to do that. And then there's the other nice little song that people sing is about, you know, this is a time when you can't smoke your pipe. You can also stop to no more whiskey. So it tells you how, in a way, it part of popular culture, these songs are transmitted over generations to talk about, you know, the cultural aspect of Ramadan. Next. And there we see, this is the moon over Fez during Ramadan, the city of Fez, where a lovely music festival is held every year. Not this year, though. Next. And then, of course, the government publishes the calendar of when you start fasting, when you end fasting. Because, and this is interesting because in old times, it used to be observing when the dawn began and when the sunset happened. But nowadays, it's all done, you know, through these government agencies, and they calculate it out. But, you know, it is what it is. It's just part of progress, if you want to think of it as progress. Next. So I'm going back to that slide I showed you of Muayyad Fidin al-Shiraz's poem, and we read the middle part, but, you know, he also talks about the month of Rajab, which comes before, and Rajab is the month of the birth of Hazrat Ali. So, you know, it says, it is from you, and this is addressing the Imam, that the month of Rajab derives its sun of happiness, and the full moon thereof is the full moon of knowledge, because the Imam is a descendant of Ali, so that's a line addressed to him. We talked about what Shaban addressed to the Prophet, and then he turns to Ramadan, he says, which is followed by Allah's month. And Ramadan is then called Allah's month, and every one of these months possesses great honor. So, you know, we need to think about why is it Allah's month? Well, because, you know, this is the time of frequent prayer, remembrance, and practicing ethics of you know, the Prophet, in a way, exemplified. Next slide. So the next slide is a wonderful slide. It is this account that people had, that the Prophet was most generous. He was most generous during Ramadan, and in Ramadan, Jibreel would come and they would review the Quran. And this is the way we have the order of the Quran, where the ayats have been put together. So you can see Ramadan is associated with generosity, it is associated with the Quran, and obviously it's associated with fasting. You know, and we only look at one of them sometimes. We forget that all of these are part of the way in which Ramadan is described. In fact, in the Quran, you know, it is explicitly stated that Ramadan is the month in which the Quran was revealed. Next. So I'm going to just very briefly say that, you know, life in Ramadan is quite different. People wake up later than normally. The working hours are adjusted. The men accused of women of you sleep late, you do know nothing, you're at home, we're going to work. So this is the kind of gender aspect. But they forget the women are the ones who are preparing the meal. They're getting up early in the morning to do the suhoor. You know, so you can see that how gender plays a role. There are some particular foods that are very much Ramadan foods. The meals tend to be much more lavish. There's an expectation of guests because guests bring ajr. Remember in the dua we say ajran azima, a great reward. And the idea of ajr and sawab are very important aspects of looking at Ramadan. This is a time to gather the reward that you can get. There are soccer games because you want to show how tough you are even when you're fasting. And in iftar, of course, the poor people have a very simple meal. The Will people have a more elaborate meal. Everybody eats the soup with their wooden spoon. And that was the picture we had right at the beginning of the slide presentation of the spoon and the soup. And then some people go to prayer after the iftar, they go to Tarawih prayers. Most women pray at home because they see the mosque as a man's place. They're not welcome there. You know, they watch TV. There are cereals that are very special for Ramadan that are produced. Men go to cafes. And then the younger people who stroll. And, you know, what is not common during other times of the year is allowed here. It's a special time of the year. So that there's a lot of flirting that's going on. Women are strolling, or young women or young girls. It's not something that happens the rest of the time of the year. And I think you can think about this idea of this is liminality, transformed space. And that happens to us when we have didar or mulakat with the imam. We are before the imam, both men and women interspersed together. This is not how we normally hold Jamaat Khana. So there are certain things that we do in liminal times and places that we don't normally do.
Alnoor, before you move on to your next slide, do you mind just telling us a little bit about what Tarawih is? Because I think that might be new for some people.
Yes, so Tarawih is interesting. It is a kind of prayers and recitation of the Quran that occurs at night. And what is interesting about that, this is not a prophetic practice. This is a practice that was actually introduced by Omar. And, you know, there's all of these ideas that, you know, we practice the faith of the Prophet, but there is a sense of, yes, things do change and some changes are good. And Tarawih is one of these good changes. So, but yeah, this is very important. And, you know, but again, I think it's not that everybody goes to it. People make a choice that they want to go to it. Some people, as you can see, people go to cafe. So that's a Tarawih prayer. Did you want to add anything else?
So this is a very much a Sunni practice, right? So for example, 12ers, Boras wouldn't participate in Tarawih.
No, because they associate with Omar, and Omar is not seen as a good example.
An authority.
Exactly. Yeah. Next one. So this is a particular kind of cookie that's only available during Ramadan. It's a shmakia. So again, there are particular Ramadan foods that are part of the Muslim experience. Next. And you can see this is a wonderful cartoon about overindulgence. So good food means you can eat too much. And there in Arabic, it says the diseases of Ramadan. And there you can see the person lying right on the hospital bed with a very thin wife, but the patient is obviously been eating too much for Ramadan. So they can make fun of themselves. It's not just, you know, yeah. Go ahead, next one. And this is the soccer being played in Ramadan that I told you about. Next. And then there are, you know, some special dates in Ramadan. So middle of Ramadan, you've completed half of Ramadan. It's an occasion to kind of celebrate. You give gifts to children so that they begin to love for Ramadan. And it's a special food. They cook rabbit. So supply of rabbits is very, you know, is being sought for, expensive. All of the kinds of things in the market that happen that we have today with COVID, toilet paper, you know, and so forth. But that's what happens on the middle of Ramadan. In the 27th of Ramadan is Laylatul Qadr. We shall come back to it again later. This is some first time that young children may start fasting. There is obviously the prayer in the mosque, the Quran recitation. The king comes, and the king's attendance is broadcast live. Those who cannot go to the mosque send couscous to the mosque because there's a great deal of ajr, sawab, merit in that. And you know, the sadaqah of giving couscous to the mosque on Laylatul Qadr is more than sadaqah given during all the other days of Ramadan. The women are not welcome, they don't prefer to go to the mosque, they go to ziyarah. The ziyarah is interesting because they go to Sufi shrines. Again, Salafis look down upon that. And again, there's a debate in Morocco also between the Salafis and the practice that's predominant. On the next day, people go to the gravesite to visit, you know, the departed. And in that sense, they clean the grave and they make visiting the people who have departed part of the practice of Ramadan. Next. So this is, as we know, this is the surah we're reciting. Laylatul Qadr, we are all familiar with it, so I'll skip it. Next. This is the prayer. You can see it goes all the way into the street on a little gutter. Next. The next one is the king. You can see he is right there in the masjid on a little gutter. Next. And this is the Sufi shrines that women go to. This is the shrine of Sidi or Sayyid Ben Sliman Ibn Sulaiman. So there are 7 Sufis associated with the founding of Morocco, Marrakesh, and women end up going to those shrines. Next. And then we have Eid al-Fitr. As you know, Eid al-Fitr is a time of giving zakat to people you normally don't really interact with, the person who plays the reed to wake up people for Ramadan in the mornings, the hammam people, the trash collector, the watchman, right? And then it's traditional to eat a particular kind of porridge and to say Mabruk, Lik, Eid Mubarak in a sense, new clothes, all of the kinds of things that are found in other parts of the Muslim world. Next. And then, of course, there is Mendi. So there's an example of Mendi. So why don't I stop here? I hope I didn't take too much time, but I think I did. I'm sorry about that, Meena. Let's move on to Hussein. I think what is interesting is the connection now, how we get from Morocco to America.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that, but Alnoor, you can always take time. As one of my mentors, it's always a pleasure to hear from you and hear you speak. So I want to start a little bit, as Alnoor said, talking about North America. And one of the first things I just want to highlight to you, we're not going to talk about it right now, I'll come back to this, but is it Ramadan or is it Ramzan? Again, if New York City is the most diverse population of Muslims in the world, that means that you have Muslims from every country in the world speaking all sorts of languages and all the ways in which they name the month. But as Alnoor said, from Morocco to the United States is actually quite a logical leap. Some of you may know that, of course, the first nation to recognize the independence of the United States was Morocco. And that President Thomas Jefferson, hosted the first White House iftar for the Moroccan ambassador. There is a very long-standing and very close relationship between the United States and Morocco. I think one of the things that we really have to emphasize is that it's not just Morocco, but it is the long history of Muslims in the United States. I think as a predominantly immigrant community, we tend to think of the 20th century as being a time when Muslims come to the Americas. But of course, we know historically that 10 to 12% of enslaved peoples were Muslim. We have autobiographies, we have reports, people praying, language that is actually place names that are part of the United States history. All of this comes from having Muslims who were part here in the United States before the country was founded. And I think one of the things that we don't often recognize as American Muslims is the ways in which US American Islam is always in relation to Black history in the United States. We really can't understand Islam in this country, regardless of when we came, without understanding Black history in this country. And that's a little bit outside of the scope of what we're going to do today. But I do want to focus a little bit on the Nation of Islam. Before I get there, if people are interested in this longer history, a brief overview of this history of Muslims in the United States that goes back to the period of enslavement, I did a video with the New York Times called The Secret History of Muslims in the United States. You can find it on YouTube or the New York Times. It's about 3.5 minutes, and you can check it out on your own. So when we think about the Nation of Islam, we tend to think about its founding figure, one of its founding figures, Elijah Muhammad. And when he starts the Nation of Islam, he names December as the month of fasting. He says that as Muslims, members of the nation, are to fast, but that they fast not on just on the month of Ramadan, or not on the floating days of Ramadan, but very specifically on during the month of December. In 1998, Louis Farrakhan changes that and says that the members of the Nation of Islam will then start fasting during the month of Ramadan. But he makes this argument that Elijah Muhammad made December the month of fasting for 2 reasons. One, to make it easy for Muslims to fast. Muslims who do choose to fast and can't fast during Ramadan can make up the days during the year. So Farrakhan says Elijah Muhammad made those days December. So you're fasting the equivalent number of days, but the days are shorter, so it's easier for you as a community. But also to stop the idolization of Jesus. So that December, then the meaning of December shifts from being a Christmas meaning to being a very much more Muslim observance for members of the nation. And so what we see here is that the Nation of Islam is adapting to their cultural historical situation of being descendants of enslaved peoples in the United States and understanding Christianity as being complicit in that enslavement and how they're reconfiguring American culture through religious worldview to make it work for them in ways that make sense religiously and culturally. More broadly speaking, one of the things that I track in the United States during the month of Ramadan is the ways in which the arts become more obvious. There's a Ramadan, there's a poem a day for Ramadan run by a woman named Taz or Tanzila Ahmed. There's a woman named Hind Maki who does YouTube playlists. Every year, a different YouTube playlist for Ramadan. She should be starting it this week sometime. And of course, we have musicians, our own Fez Magani, who some of you who joined early saw his video at the time of Ramadan. But you see musicians like Native Dean, Fez, Yusuf Islam putting out songs for Ramadan at this point. Yes, I know Yusuf Islam is not from the United States, but very highly consumed here within the context of the United States. One of the things that really becomes highlighted in the United States in this time period is community. We get new configurations of community. So if you have, and I'm going to talk very specifically about New York, and I keep emphasizing this because it really does inform the way in which I see Muslims in the United States, is the diversity of Muslims in New York, is that you get communities who don't normally come together now coming together for iftar during Ramadan. So if I go to New York University, where they host these big citywide iftars, you see Sunnis of different varieties, Shi'is of different varieties coming together in ways that they wouldn't normally to break fast together. And there are different times as well, because Shi'i break their fast about 20 minutes later than Sunnis. There are different food lines, but then everybody sits together to eat at the same time. And so you have these new configurations of community that then Alnoor talked about this idea of liminality, where things are not quite in the normal order, where this shift then starts becoming more hardened, and you start seeing these communities interacting more regularly post-Ramadan in these spaces. And I think for me, we have to understand that these new configurations are an evolving spiritual practice in the United States. They're allowing people to interact and create in new ways. So communities that are normally isolated from one another are now creating connections, and arts that are often shared, that often existed individually or in smaller communities, can now be shared in new ways. So I think that there is a way in which we understand Ramadan as a transformative process, not just at the individual level, but also at the communal level. And it's also time for reconnecting with tradition. And I'm gonna use Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, this oft-quoted poet who 14th century, who writes in Persian, and talk a little bit about his what he says about Ramadan. So many people are very familiar, I think, with this poem of his, where he says, there is hidden sweetness in the stomach's emptiness. We are lutes, no more, no less. If the sound box is stuffed full of anything, no music. If the brain and belly are burning clean with fasting, every moment a new song comes out of the fire. The fog clears, a new energy makes you. Run up the steps in front of you. When you fast, good habits gather like friends who want to help. And we forget that when we focus on Rumi as this mystical poet, that he's also an important legal scholar, that of course he's going to talk about the legality of fasting. And this often becomes sort of the emblematic, Rumi is this legal scholar and he brings this into his mysticism. But we forget this other poem that Rumi writes, where he says, you have many devotions to your credit, much fasting and ritual prayer, but you haven't relished those acts. There are lots of walnut shells, but none with a sweet nut inside. And so I think one of the things we have to understand, looking at these two poems in comparison, is that there's not only a diversity of practices during this month of Ramadan, but a diversity of understandings of what this month is, often within the same community. So even looking at Rumi, this great poet, this great legal scholar, understanding that he represents this diversity of what it means. And this is a great time to reconnect with these traditions, not just in saying Ramadan is one thing, but Ramadan is all these things. And it is a pivotal point, again, not only for individuals, but for community to transform themselves. One practice I started about 12 years ago, there's a habit for all Muslims, for many Muslims during the month of Ramadan, to read a 30th of the Quran every day. And about 12 years ago, Ramadan coincided with a Jewish tradition where they read the Torah. And one of my friends was tweeting selections of the Torah, and I thought that would be a great thing to do, is I'm reading the Quran, a section of the Quran every day to tweet the Quran. And so I do this under the hashtag TT Quran, for those of you who are interested. We'll be starting this Thursday night, where we read the 30th, and it's selections of the Quran that interest people. I've been tweeting tafsir, commentaries of the Quran, including one attributed to Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, and lots of artwork related to the Quran. And this is not just me, there's a whole community of people who do this, Muslim and non-Muslim, who are talking about how the Quran lives for them in this month. And how do you engage with it in new ways? How do you bring modernity and tradition together to keep these traditions alive, to keep our practices alive? And finally, for me, the highlight of Ramadan is always Laylatul Qadr, because it is this pivotal moment. Now, Alnoor, I think you said in Morocco it was the 27th of Ramadan is when it's observed. Because of the teachings of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, Shi'i communities recognize it on the 23rd night of Ramadan, which is when we recognize it. But for many Muslims, they'll say it's one of the odd days, or one of the odd nights, I should say, in the last 10 days of Ramadan. So they'll try to observe as many nights as possible. But Laylatul Qadr is, of course, the night the Quran was revealed at first to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family. And so Laylatul Qadr for me is a time to reflect about what we want out of the month and out of the year, and thinking about who are we praying for and what are our nek umid. We're not just doing it that night, but it's a lead up to that night. We've had, not even if we're not thinking about it the year, but the 23 days prior, to think about what is it we want that night. And thinking about the conflict, or not the conflict, but the debate about when the night is who decides when that night is. And when we choose that night, or when that night is decided in our community, how does it deepen our sense of community commitment and coherence? How does it affect the ways in which we practice being Muslim? So for me, Ramadan is always this month that is a reminder of what it means for us to be Muslim, and how do we choose to be Muslim, but also how is community formed, and how are we having these debates, and how do we respect, and how do we recognize and live the diversity of what it means to be Muslim all these times.
So that was really, you raised a number of points that I wanted to just share. At least it seems, you talked about the context that led the nation of Islam to think about December. And I think it would be very, very interesting to also point out that there is a context of Ramadan itself in the early Muslim community, that the early Muslim community actually lived in a context with a lot of Jewish practices. And when the Prophet moved to Medina from Mecca, there were Jews, and initially the Jews were his allies. And initially, the first year at least of their presence in Medina, the Muslims practiced the Ashura fast, the Yom Kippur fast. Whether they had done that already in Mecca, I don't think the sources are clear about that. But it is very clear that with the break of the Muslim community with the Jewish community, that Ramadan comes into play as the month of fasting. So you can see the context plays a role. And it's also very clear that Ramadan actually had a particular significance in pre-Islamic Arabia as one of the 3 sacred months. So, one can also think about that particular context. In Ramadan played a role. Yeah. So it's a heightened time of ethics, but it's also the ethics you should have for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think about it a lot as catalytic moments. What are the things that happen once that should transform us in some capacity, right? So whether it's Ramadan, whether it's Beej, whether it's Didar, what are these catalytic moments that create durable change? So we're developing ourselves physically, spiritually, mentally, right? All these things that we're told are ethics of the faith. How do we sharpen these? What are the moments that allow us to sharpen these elements?
Yeah.
I'm hearing from Meena that I wasn't very clear about the tweeting the Quran thing. So for those of you who are interested, it's something that happens on Twitter. People read on their own. You do it on your own time. I will be tweeting it regularly. You can find me on Twitter. And you just use the hashtag TT Quran. So however works for you, if you're interested in joining, and you don't have to do it every night, but whatever makes you happy. Alnoor, I think you have a couple of great slides before we hand it over to Meena and Q&A about the Fatimids and Ramadan, which I think would be a shame not to mention.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting that these days when you see Ramadan, you see this particular lamp as shown in, Ramadan Mubarak or in any kind of big, image about Ramadan. And what we know is this is called a fanus, and it was first used to welcome Imam Muiz to Cairo, and that happened in Ramadan. So the population lighted candles, and to make it safe, they put it in this particular wooden at that time, but in a shape of a lantern. And this became part of what the children did. They would carry these lamps. They would ask for sweets. These were, Imam Hakim asked that women go out with somebody who had a lantern. So this became part of the contribution to the kind of material culture around Ramadan that has been adopted in much of the world, but many people don't know its origins. And what if people know that the Ismaili games that we had in Dubai, they use a fanus that was carried from one place to the other, and this is where it comes from. So there's an interesting connection to Ramadan with this particular lamp and the Fatimids. And you look at the next slide. And then, so there is a material culture, but there's also food. And, people, for Ramadan and food, it's not just the absence of food, it's the presence of food. So it's the absence of food in certain parts of today, but the presence of lots of food in other parts of today. And this wonderful dessert that's part of the Egypt and certainly Syria and other areas is called kunafa or kanafe. And it is said it was invented by the Fatimids. There's a bit of controversy about all of these things. Claims, everybody wants to be the one who invented things, but kunafa is an interesting connection if it is certainly, if one can say that the Fatimids are the originators of this authentic.
No, this was great, and I think on behalf of our audience, we're so grateful for what you've been able to share, Dr. Dhanani, Dr. Rashid. I am mindful of the time, and usually we do try to end close to on top of the hour. So what I'll do very quickly, because there are at least a couple of questions that we'd like to get to, is first, if I can make an announcement for those of you, if you do need to hop off for any reason, which we completely understand. Starting this Thursday on Chandrat, ITREB USA is launching a new webinar series called Aspire. And this one will feature Dr. Nargis Virani as our first speaker on the topic of drinking at the fount of our faith. It'll offer perspectives from our faith on approaching success, failure, good times versus bad times, and more. The webinar will be this Thursday, 8 p.m. Central. So again, it'll be this Thursday, 8 p.m. Central. Dr. Nargis Virani will be talking to us on the topic of drinking at the fount of our faith for the Aspire series, and the registration links will be sent out shortly. With that said, again, thank you both. I think we're tight on time for questions, so I'll try to ask a couple. We had a lot come in. And I'll pose this one to both of you. So we did get quite a few questions, and if you've been perusing the chat box and the Q&A box, Dr. Dhanani, Dr. Rashid, I'm sure you've seen them, regarding fasting, regarding commemoration practices during the month of Ramadan. And I think it's been alluded throughout both of your presentations. So the question that I think will kind of wrap some of these together is, is there a way that you can give us tips or maybe some entry points to being more sort of taking initiative on how we can understand more about this commemoration around the world, about how the global Jamaat commemorates, the Ummah at large commemorates, and how we can sort of become more literate in thinking about these transformative personal choices and so on.
So it's certainly, I mean, from what we saw with the Fatimids, it's certainly clear that our practices, have varied over time and place. And I think it's that balance between the spiritual aspects of what the month means versus the kind of physical aspects of it. And I think that, in the context in which parts of our Jamaat was, the conditions were different. But I do think that, at the end of the day, like I said, the lived Islam is one of personal choice. And I think both Hussein and I, reached our engagement with what Ramadan means with us on a personal level. And I think a lot of people who make it, and I think people make different choices as to what that should mean. I think that one of the things that distinguish, or at least in my mind, is a distinguishing feature of the Ismaili community is the importance of personal choice and personal intellectual engagement. I think this is what I understand by personal search. And I think there is, in our tradition, the ethics are there. And, how you choose to engage physically or spiritually with practices, at the end of the day, is really something that you have to be comfortable with it yourself, with your own health conditions, with your own understanding. Is it supposed to be from dawn to sunset? Well, I think you need to, there are multiple opinions out there. The Muslim community is not a monolith. And I presume if one were to ask, well, shouldn't the Ismaili community be making monolithic pronouncements? And I don't think it has in the past, and the community has different understandings. So I think that, we have this rich, diverse heritage. The diverse heritage is also personal heritage. And I think that, just like in my own growing up, there were many different commitments, many different ways of practicing. That's how I see it. That's how, at least this is what I wanted to say in my personal story.
So I will come at this from a slightly different perspective. I teach a lot about narratives and different narratives, particularly in the North American context. So I'll just mention a couple of things if people want to read other people's personal stories to see how they're navigating them. I think not in disagreement with Alnoor, but to actually see this in practice, examples of the types of things he's talking about. People who choose to fast, not fast, the ways they interact with the month, or even what it means to be Muslim. I put up a slide of a series called I Speak for Myself. There's several books in the series, but the first one is about American Muslim women. The second is about American Muslim men. Right, and I think we also have to recognize how gendered a lot of these practices are. The ways in which women interact with Ramadan is very different. Alnoor hinted at that some in Morocco in terms of physicality of it, but also in terms of questions of menstruation, who can practice, pregnancy, all these things come into play. There are very good fiction stories. I know I've been talking a lot about the United States. I'll mention a Canadian example. There's a wonderful author named Asma Zinat Khan, who writes a mystery series set in Toronto, where the lead detective is Muslim. And one of the stories, I can't remember which, I'll find out, where he talks about fasting during Ramadan, which is fantastic. But the series itself is great if you want to get a sense of different ways Muslims in Toronto live. I think it's a great anthropological lens. So there are these stories that are out there. And of course, during Ramadan, you'll find lots of websites that are putting this out. It's really looking for reliable sources. And I think I'll give a lot of credit to STEP teachers. They've really been on the ball here in the United States in terms of looking for these resources for their students. So if you are near a STEP center, a STEP teacher, I'm going to put a little burden of work on them and ask them and see if they can share some of those resources with you as well.
Awesome. No, thanks for both of you for sharing a little bit about that. I have been seeing a couple more questions come in about Twitter. And so what I did want to share on behalf of Dr. Rashid is you can visit his website. So that's just HusseinRashid.com. And if you do that, you'll be able to get a little bit more access and get the information you need to interact with him on Twitter and sort of stay up with what he's talking about for the Thursday tweets. Another question that's been coming up is that there are those who are sort of craving this sort of intellectual inquiry of wanting to learn more, of engaging with their mind and learning to dig into this. And they're looking for guidance on how to start. You know, are there sources or places you would encourage them to look, texts that you might direct them to, in addition to what you just shared of sort of the human resources, the people capacity that we have? Is there anything else that you could give them to kind of direct and guide this process?
So Hussein, why don't you start first here?
You know, for me, a lot of my introduction to this thinking, again, coming back to my liberal arts education that Alnoor mentioned as well, was really looking at the arts. You know, there are actually not very good playlists on Spotify. I was kind of disappointed to find out for Ramadan, but if you do a search for Ramzan, you'll find material. Coke Studio has a lot of great stuff. For me, a lot of it is oral, is music, is understanding how people practice that way. I think is important. And of course, there's some great artwork on various museums. You know, the Icon Museum has gone all virtual. You'll find various Eid paintings that are out there. The Met Museum, Cleveland, Royal Ontario Museum, they all have great collections. Victoria and Albert in London all have great collections that are online now. These would all be entry points for me.
You know, I think for me, what was interesting was to see that religious traditions share a lot of perspectives. So they share the idea of prayer, they share the idea of abstention, they share the idea of ethical living, they share the idea of taking care of creation. So there are lots of these, you know, senses that transcend one particular faith or one particular sect, and it would seem to me that this is how, you know, I would think about practices that we have in Islam and in the denominations of Islam. You know, these are very much shared traditions of human religious communities. And therefore, I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned, Hussein, about how to think about Passover and its kind of intersection with Ramadan in that particular year. But, you know, I think this is important for us to think that, you know, our religious experiences are not, in a sense, unique in the sense that their forms are unique to us. And so I have found that thinking about religion that way, and you know, there are lovely programs that occur on PBS and so forth that discuss religion. And even though they are not about your faith, you can say, "Oh yes, we do similar things. We understand similar things." And so I would recommend people to look at some of these wonderful programming that has happened about other faith traditions, including the Muslim tradition. But that's, you know, especially now that we are all stuck at home and looking at what to watch. Netflix is okay, but sometimes maybe looking at PBS and see what's available in religion there could be very interesting. So that's, I would think that's a source that, you know, sometimes, you know, in the past, to say, do I have the time to watch a 1 hour series, you know, over a number of weeks? I would say, no, I don't have the time. But I think people have a lot of time on their hands, and maybe this is a good time to take advantage of that.
No, I think this is great, and you know, we're all very, very fortunate. I did kind of want to keep track of the time, and so though we did have other questions, I'm hopeful that along, you know, with the resources and the knowledge that both of you have shared, Dr. Dhanani, Dr. Rashid, has given everyone food for thought and something to think through as we get very close to what Thursday night, heading into this new experience in a new time, I would say, a new time for our generation, certainly. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that joined in and took time out of their Sunday to be here and to think about this. I hope this was fruitful for you. You know, this will be happening every Sunday, and so, you know, keep an eye out for the next announcement. And then, as I mentioned again, I'll reiterate that on Chandrat this Thursday, ITREB USA is launching a new webinar series called Aspire. This week's topic will be Drinking at the Fount of Our Faith with Dr. Nargis Virani. And the webinar will be at 8 p.m. Central on Thursday. Registration will be sent out shortly. Would highly encourage taking a look at it if you're available and would like to join in with this. And we hope to see you join us again next weekend on Sunday for the next topic. Thank you so much, everyone. Yali Madad, have a good rest of your Sunday and a good week ahead.
Thank you.
Ramadan Kareem, everyone, in advance.
Ramadan Kareem.